Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be diving into the protests currently unfolding in Georgia as I speak, which is strikingly reminiscent to me of the 2014 Euromaidan protests in Ukraine that occurred 10 years ago. Once again, we see a nation caught between dreams of joining the Western economic bloc and the harsh realities of the struggle that would entail. But is that dream worth the pain? Or is it, as some might argue, a mirage, promising hope? But will it be delivering only chaos? We'll find out. So, today I'll be breaking down and walking you guys through an article from the CNN titled Georgia's Being Rocked by Growing Protests. Here's what you need to know. So, this article delves into ongoing protests in Georgia, sparked by the government's decision to delay EU accession talks. Tensions have been building over the accusations of authoritarianism and pro-Russian policies under the ruling Georgian Dream Party. The policy's response has been harsh, with the West and local oppositions criticizing the government's shift away from Europe. This has placed Georgia at a crossroads between its European ambitions and Russia's growing influence. So why does this matter? Well, the protests signify a critical moment in Georgia's future. They highlight the struggle between maintaining democratic values and facing pressure from Russia. As Georgia's EU accession hopes dim, the country's political direction is in question, with broader implications for the region's geopolitics. So, I want to ask you guys, how did we get here? Well, the first key point I'm going to be discussing is the trigger for the protests. The Georgian Dream government's decision to suspend EU talks until 2028 sparked this outrage. It was seen as a betrayal of the country's European aspirations. The move came after the European Parliament rejected Georgia's election results, citing irregularities. This led many Georgians to question the government's legitimacy and their pro-Western future. Thousands have rallied, chanting for European integration, despite violent clashes with the police. Protesters continued their demands for re-election and a European path. And I have a quote from the article that represents this very accurately. Many protests fear that the government's actions are a sign of Georgia turning its back on the EU and opening the door to Russian influence once again. The government's decision to suspend EU talks also came after Georgia's opposition accused the ruling party of being too closely aligned with Russia, further aggravating concerns about the country's future in Europe. Protesters argue that the government's pro-Russian stance is undermining Georgia's sovereignty, leading to fears that Georgia may become a proxy for Russia's interest in the region. Many see this move as cynical, in an attempt to weaken domestic opposition, while also placating Moscow, which has long called for Georgia's retreat from its Western aspirations. So, just by looking at how the EU went about this, it seems they're not happy with how this election turned out, of course, because for them, it's only democracy if the party or person that they designate wins for their interests, not for the native citizens of that country. Now, with Georgia's Dream Party talking into consideration and how things are in Europe, and with Russia, which honestly would make sense. I also wouldn't say that the Georgian Dream Party is aligned with Russia at all. And yes, I know, they literally border Russia. But they have seen what happened to Ukraine with their Maidan revolution back in 2013 to 2014. Yeah, it didn't end well for them at all, as we're currently seeing. One could argue that the EU looks very imperialistic, forcing countries to join them through bribes and or even blackmail, like for example, propping up riots or protests, similar to what we are seeing in Georgia right now. However, I do foresee that Russia might actually have to intervene in Georgia if things do get actually out of control, even though they already have a lot on their plate, Ukraine, Syria, and so on. But I digress. This tension leads us to examine the larger question of Russian influence. So, the role of Russian influence in Georgia. The Georgian Dream Party, founded by the billionaire with ties to Russia, has drawn accusations of pro-Russian policies. This is deeply unpopular among the Georgians, many of whom have strong anti-Russian sentiments. The government's actions have been seen as aligning with Russia's interest, especially as Moscow has criticized the protests, calling them attempts at destabilization. While Russia's direct involvement is limited, their influence looms large, especially after the 2008 war and the ongoing occupation of the Georgian territories. And I have another quote from the article that illustrates this perfectly. Russia sees Georgia's democratic movements as a threat. This could have wider implications for how Georgia navigates its relationship with both Russia and the West. The Georgian government has long been under pressure from Russia, which seeks to maintain its sphere of influence over the former Soviet republics. As such, Georgia's European ambitions are a significant point of the tension, with Russia's continued occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, making it more vulnerable to Russian pressure. Critics argue that the government's action might be a strategy to maintain stability at the expense of Georgian sovereignty, effectively curtailing hopes of further integration into the West. Russia's influence is not really there, excluding the two regions that Russia took from Georgia back in 2008. But I will say this. Since Georgia is in the sphere of Russia's presence, there are certain rules. Rules that allow Russia to have some say, depending on how the situation of Georgia changes, of course. Just as much as America would when it comes to Canada and Mexico in terms of influence. It's going to be very difficult for Georgia moving forward now, with pressure coming from both sides. But how is the rest of the world responding to these events? International reactions to this? Well, the US and the EU have criticized the crackdown on protesters, urging the Georgian government to return to its European path and uphold democratic values. The US has suspended US Georgia Strategic Partnership, highlighting the growing concerns over authoritarianism in Georgia. The EU has also warned of consequences, showing support for Georgian protesters and their European aspirations. And I have another quote that illustrates this perfectly. The international community is watching closely, and their response will be key in shaping Georgia's future on the global stage. Now, Western leaders have expressed their disappointment over Georgia's backsliding on the democratic reforms, pointing to government's increasingly authoritarian tactics. There are growing fears that if Georgia's government remains entrenched, it could open the door for Russia to deepen its influence in the region. The West might respond with more sanctions or diplomatic measures if the situation worsens. The involvement of foreign governments in this domestic disputes could escalate tensions, prompting a deeper confrontation between Georgia's pro-European forces and those seeking closer ties with Russia. The pressure, it seems to be coming from the West, rather than Russia itself, in my opinion. You also have the global South criticizing Western interference through mainstream and social media platforms. Now, America's role here is to cause more instability within Georgia itself and for Russia to put even more pressure on them, despite everything else Russia is already dealing with. One could argue, if we look at Georgia, both the EU and NATO are courting them to join their organizations as well. Because when you really look at it, it's about solidifying the unipolar world, bringing it back under Western dominated control, whether that's economic, military, or even culturally. However, this will only add more fuel to the fire, with economic deals and false projections of success, when those living in the West can clearly see it. It's not working as well as we would hope. Amidst this backdrop, though, the Georgian president has taken a controversial stance. The Georgian president's refusal to step down. Now, the Georgian president has refused to step down, stating that she is guided by EU officials' interests, believing that her leadership is necessary for Georgia's long-term European path. The EU's support for the president has been crucial in navigating these political crises, though some accuse the EU of using her as a pawn in their geopolitical agenda. Many Georgians see her as a barrier to meaningful democratic change, accusing her of prioritizing EU relations over the country's independence. And there's another quote that illustrates this. Despite overwhelming public pressure, the president believes her course is aligned with the EU's best interest, but her position risks alienating the very people she aims to represent. So the president's refusal to step down has created a significant divide between the government and the opposition. With protesters demanding her resignation, many citizens see the president's stance as an attempt to maintain control at the expense of true democratic process, further fueling the perception that the government is prioritizing external relations over national interests. The EU's involvement has been a double-edged sword, offering support but also fueling allegations that Georgia's sovereignty is being compromised in the name of European integration. Ironic, isn't it? Western democratic countries will say a president stepping down is anti-democratic. But wouldn't it be the opposite? I mean, guys, correct me if I'm wrong here. Remember, If Western countries want you out, they'll make it happen through economic sanctions, NGOs, which I'll get to in a moment, and finally, military intervention, all in the name of democracy. You gotta love it. Now, let's talk about Salome Zorababili, the Georgian president. Her refusal to step down. No surprise if you really dig into her backstory. And here's what I mean by that. She worked as a diplomat in the French diplomatic services. Plus, a key fact, she was also born in France, not in Georgia. This creates an issue. She could also easily be considered a foreign agent or a foreign asset for Western countries, someone with no loyalty to or understanding of her own people's mindset. It's a valid argument. Meanwhile, we're also seeing Western leaders proclaim they themselves won't leave office, even if there's an early parliamentary election. Take Macron, for example. He recently said he would stay in office until his term ends in 2027. Welcome to democracy, guys. You really gotta love it. This deadlock adds another layer of complexity to Georgia's current struggle, inviting comparisons to Ukraine's 2014 Maidan revolution. So, the EU's strategy to rekindle a Ukrainian Maidan scenario. Well, some analysts argue that EU support for the protests in Georgia resembles its involvement in Ukraine's 2014 Maidan revolution. The EU's backing for protesters could be seen as an attempt to replicate the unrest seen in Ukraine, further destabilizing the region and challenging Russia's sphere of influence. By encouraging popular protests, the EU might be aiming to undermine Russia's grip on Georgia, creating a proxy conflict similar to the one in Ukraine. And here's another tidbit from the article, or a quote. Just like Ukraine, Georgia could become a battleground for competing interests, with Russia on one side and the EU on the other, both using internal divisions as a tool of influence, and that would be correct. The EU is clearly creating another Maidan-like scenario within Georgia. Except, I wonder, will they have freedom cookies to hand out this time? The Georgian government is already split. The Georgian Dream Party leans more towards neutrality, focusing on figuring things out. Meanwhile, the opposition parties are in full support of joining the EU and even NATO. And they have the backing of Georgia's current president, someone with ties to a prominent EU member state, and that would be France, possibly even with Macron himself. This approach, combined with sanctions, is a strategy to force Georgia to bend to the EU's demands. Demands about who they want in power, especially countries bordering Russia, of course. There are even rumors that some high profile Ukrainian figures were seen in Georgia, offering public support to create the image of a genuine people's call for change. But it's not. One last thing I want to say about the EU's interference. The dream of economic mobility by joining the EU? It's a false image. It's not even realistic. To those in Georgia who dream of joining the EU, here's my suggestion. Go live in the EU for more than a year, then come back. And let's talk about this so called perfect image of the EU is projecting to the world. So, if the EU is indeed pursuing such a strategy, it raises a critical question about its potential long term impact, not just in Georgia, but on Russia as well, as EU's strategy is to cause chaos for Russia, as some experts believe that the EU's action in Georgia are part of a broader strategy to destabilize Russia amidst its existing internal and external challenges as we're currently seeing. With Russia already dealing with severe domestic issues, such as economic instability and its military campaign in Ukraine, the EU might see Georgia as an opportunity to further stretch Russia's resources by backing the protests and potentially creating more instability in Georgia, of course. The EU could be attempting to provoke Russia into overextending itself, distracting it from other fronts. In this context, Georgia becomes a pawn in a larger geopolitical chess game, with the EU and Russia vying for control of influence in the region. And here's another quote that illustrates this pretty well. Russia's internal problems are already mounting, and the EU may view Georgia as a lever to tip the scales even further, accelerating Russia's geopolitical struggles. Now, the EU's involvement in Georgia may be part of a calculated effort to engage Russia in a protracted geopolitical struggle, aiming to weaken Russia's influence in the South Caucasus region, as we're currently seeing. With Russia's attention already divided by ongoing conflicts and economic sanctions, the European Union may see Georgia as a strategic pivot point, hoping to create enough instability to hinder Russia's long-term plans for regional dominance. Well, antagonizing Russia while it's currently busy, that's not something they should be doing. But on a logical level, with Russia having its hands currently full, It is a very bold strategy, I might say. Now, the question is, will the people in Georgia understand the gravity of joining the EU? Because that move inevitably leads to joining NATO. And Russia, they're not going to allow that, just like they didn't allow it with Ukraine 10 years ago. So I get why they would accuse Russia of interfering with Georgia's voting process and whatnot. But that doesn't excuse the EU's action over there at all. Ask yourself this: would America, let's say during the Cold War era, ever allow Mexico to become communist? Or even join the Warsaw Pact? That's going to be a hard no. And yes, I know the EU is an economic bloc, but it is also evolving. Member states are even talking about creating an EU army. So keep that in mind. Then there's the usage of NGOs. It's concerning to say the least. These organizations are often funded by Western groups connected to high profile political leaders or parties to push a specific agenda. We've seen this happen in Ukraine and many other places over the past few years. Personally, I think there should be a massive regulation on NGOs, in my opinion. It's the only way to prevent them from doing what they have done in Ukraine and now in Georgia. As for Georgia's Dream Party, I don't even know if they will stabilize the situation, but at least they seem to understand the consequences of being used as a proxy. Just look at Ukraine. It's not going well for them at all. And to top it off, Georgia still remembers what happened back in 2008. That's a memory that's still fresh in their minds. Well, this geopolitical chess game places Georgia at the heart of a larger struggle between the East and the West, making its future more uncertain than ever. Now, here's my final thoughts. The decision currently in Georgia is very critical for the government. It's about holding on to power and influence. For the people, it's about their future in Europe, democracy, and independence. And for the international community, it's going to be a test of how far they're willing to go to support those who fight for their democratic rights. Now, the key takeaways, the next steps, whether in Georgia's internal politics or on the broader international response, will definitely shape not only the country's future, but also the broader struggle for European integration and sovereignty. And if I may also conclude on one final point, I want you guys to understand this whole concept of colored revolutions, NGO backed protests, or even revolts needs to be looked at on a very, very realistic level because all of this stuff is obviously pre planned and obviously prepaid. So, for citizens in countries that are concerned that this might happen, I would definitely suggest, in my opinion, not saying you should do, but in my opinion, look where the money is coming from. And also, if you have friends who are more in support of something like this and you feel uncomfortable, speak with them and say, hey, no, this is wrong. Who's paying you? What's the goal here? Do you expect life if you join another organization to be even better? You know, ask them to use their brain, critical thinking. That's going to help them in the long run. Otherwise, guys, just be aware and just pay attention on the current news, and we'll see what happens for Georgia in the coming days, maybe weeks, maybe even months. Otherwise, guys, if you can please leave a like and hit that subscribe button, I'd greatly appreciate it. Have a great day.